Let's be honest, you've probably heard the term deconstruction before, right? It gets thrown around a lot. It sounds complex, maybe a little bit intimidating. But what if I told you that to really get it, we just need to go back in time, back to a single, really dramatic moment at an academic conference? So let's do it. Let's see where it all began.
Okay, picture this. The year is 1966. In the world of big ideas, a theory called structuralism is king, and its undisputed ruler is the famous anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. So Johns Hopkins University throws this huge conference, basically to celebrate him, to celebrate the whole movement. It's supposed to be a coronation. But then, this young, relatively unknown philosopher named Jacques Derrida gets up to speak. And what he says? Well, it's not a celebration.
It was a revolution, all packed into a single speech. People who were there said it felt like a dethroning. See, Derrida wasn't just poking holes in a theory. He was questioning the very ground everyone was standing on. To get what he did, we first have to understand the world he was about to turn upside down. So, what was this powerful theory, structuralism, all about? Well, it all boiled down to one really potent idea, the concept of a center.
It sounds like a simple question, right? But seriously, the answer to this one question, it unlocks everything. For the structuralists, a center is that fixed point that everything else revolves around. It's the sun in a solar system of meaning.
Right, so this center, and Derrida has this great fancy term for it, the transcendental signified, is what anchors the whole system. It gives it order, a backbone. But, and this is absolutely crucial, it also sets the rules. It limits what he calls the free play of meaning inside that system.
Here's a great way to think about it. The Eiffel Tower. I mean, it's basically an empty structure, right? A kind of virtual access point. And yet, from its peak, the entire sprawling city of Paris seems to organize itself perfectly below you. Fun fact, the writer Guy de Maupassant supposedly hated the tower so much that he'd eat lunch in its restaurant every day, because it was the only place in Paris where he didn't have to look at it.
Or how about this? There's this poem by Wallace Stevens where someone places a simple, round jar in the middle of the Tennessee wilderness, and suddenly all that messy, untamed nature arranges itself around the jar. The jar itself is totally arbitrary. It has nothing to do with nature, but it took dominion. It tames what he calls the slovenly wilderness. That's exactly what a center does.
Okay, so you have this idea of a stable, organizing center, and this is precisely where Derrida steps in. He looks at this core concept and finds this deep, inescapable paradox at its heart. And here's the contradiction Derrida points out. For a center to organize a system, it has to be part of that system, right? It has to be inside, governing things. But for it to be the origin of the system, it has to exist before the system. It has to be outside of it. So how can it be both? How can it be inside and outside at the same time? For Derrida, this was the impossible problem at the very heart of Western thought. And Derrida saw this playing out across the entire history of philosophy. It was just a long story of substituting one center for another. First, you had a theocentric world where God was the center, somehow both outside creation and present within it. Then, after the Enlightenment, you get anthropocentrism. Man becomes the new center. And then, in the 20th century, we get a new one. Language itself. But this is where things get really interesting. What makes language a fundamentally different kind of center than, say, God or man? And this just nails Derrida's point. You can at least imagine a God that exists before the world, or a human consciousness that observes the world from a certain remove. But language? Language can't do that. It can never get outside of itself. It's always caught up in the very things it's trying to talk about. It can't be both the cookie and the cookie cutter. So this massive insight meant the old vocabulary just wasn't going to work anymore. If meaning isn't tied to some stable center, then what on earth is it? Derrida basically had to invent new words to describe this new way of seeing things. So the old model of language from the linguist Saussure was pretty neat. You have a concept, like the idea of a tree, and it's directly linked to the word tree. Simple. Derrida just blows that up.
He says no. The word tree doesn't point to some pure, abstract idea of a tree. It just points to an endless chain of other words. Arbor, wood, forest, leaf, and on and on and on in this constant forward rush. And that leads him to his most famous and, yeah, famously untranslatable idea: difference. It's a pun, a play on words. Spelled the normal way, with an E, difference just means difference, in a static way. Like how hot gets its meaning from not being cold. But Derrida's version, with an A, adds the idea of deferral. That meaning is always being pushed down the road, put off, unfolding in time. And the genius of it is that you can only see the difference in the spelling. You can't hear it when you say it. It was a direct shot at philosophy's age-old preference for spoken word over writing.
Then there's this wonderfully slippery concept of the supplement. Just think about that word for a second. If you take a vitamin supplement, are you doing it because you have a deficiency to complete something that's missing? Or are you just adding something extra, a bonus, to a body that's already whole and healthy? It kind of means both at once, doesn't it? For Derrida, that ambiguity was the whole point. It proved that the idea of a complete text or a whole meaning was an illusion from the start.
Now, with ideas this radical and, well, this weird, they were bound to be misunderstood. So let's clear up the single biggest misconception about what deconstruction is all about. This is probably Derrida's most infamous line. His critics heard this and thought he was saying that reality doesn't exist, that it's all just words on a page. But that is not at all what he meant.
He wasn't saying that rocks and trees and other people aren't real. He was saying that our access to them, our history, our consciousness, our science, our entire way of making sense of the world is structured like a text. We live inside these webs of language. There's no way to step outside of that to get some kind of pure, unfiltered view of reality.
So what are the political implications of all this? Well, this core idea of undecidability, that meaning is never perfectly fixed, has been seen in two completely opposite ways. Some critics argue that if nothing is certain, it just opens up a vacuum where fanaticism and tyranny can rush in. But others say, no, it's the exact opposite. Deconstruction is a tool for being constantly vigilant, for scrutinizing any opinion that claims to have all the answers, and for resisting fanaticism and tyranny.
Derrida himself seemed to know just how radical and unsettling his ideas were. At the end of that famous 1966 talk, he described the new kind of thinking that was being born. He said it was still unnameable, and that it could only appear in the formless, mute, infant, and terrifying form of monstrosity. What a shocking but incredibly powerful way to describe a brand new idea.
Which brings us back around to this final question, one borrowed from the poet W.B. Yeats. If our reality really is a kind of performance, a system of signs constantly shifting and moving, a dance of language, how can we ever really separate the performance from the performer, the structure from its runaway center? In short, how can we know the dancer from the dance?